All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to the Military Museums this evening. My name is Dave Peabody, and I'm the manager here at the museum, and I'm very pleased to again be welcoming the University of Calgary here for our third in a series of lectures that the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies has been putting on. Really looking forward to tonight's talk with Dr. J.C. Boucher. Some of you may have heard him speak before, but if you haven't, this is a fascinating topic, and not just fascinating, but extremely important for all of us to be aware of. I would like to just recognize a couple people in attendance tonight. First, a member of the Legislative Assembly, Mr. Justin Wright, who is the defense liaison for the provincial government. And then he was at the back. I think he's disappeared or he's hiding somewhere. Dr. David Berkeson, there he is. He changed spots on me, who was the original founder of the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies. But I don't want to drone on and on, so I'll get down to what you want to know. To my right down the hall is where the washrooms are. And make sure that your cell phones are on silent. Okay. All right, tonight JC will be giving his presentation, and then there'll be some time for Q&A afterwards. We ask that when we do the Q&A, you wait for the mic to come. Even though it might sound like you can hear yourself, often the people at the back might not be able to hear you. So I believe Mary from the center will be roving with the mic. So we'll wait for Mary to come and help you with your question. But to formally introduce tonight's event, I would like to invite the Dean of Arts for the University of Calgary, Ms. Evie McNamara, to come up and say a few words.
So welcome, and thank you so much to the Military Museums for the great partnership in hosting this lecture, and to all of you for coming to TMM for the third lecture in the Calgary Highlanders Regimental Foundation lecture. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this evening's event. So Rob Hubert is the Interim Director of the Centre for Military, Security and Strategic Studies, and he's going to tell you a little more about the lecture and how it came to be. But I'd like to take a moment to give the land acknowledgement, and before I hand it over to Rob, I'd like to talk a little bit about the extraordinary achievements of CMSS and all that it does for the Faculty of Arts, the University of Calgary, and the greater Calgary community. And I note we stop there, but I think it's very reasonable to say that it has an impact beyond that, and certainly at a national and I would say, increasingly international way. So this is a huge honour to be here this evening. So I will start by looking at where we are today and thinking about what that means in relation to what we're about to hear. So we're gathered here together this evening in the heart of southern Alberta. And together we offer this land acknowledgement as a way to acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7. And that includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, who are comprised of the Siksika, the Bagainai and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Goodstoney, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw and Goodstoney First Nations. And the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. And it seems fitting, too, in thinking about this land acknowledgement, to think of the long and proud history that Indigenous people have played in the Canadian Armed Services. So the Centre for Military, Security and Strategic Studies is a research centre at the University of Calgary. It was established in 1999, and it draws from a variety of disciplines, including anthropology, political science, history, religious studies, economics, and computer science. And I know recently, through one of its more recent fellows, also film studies. So the centre has an impact that exceeds its size, particularly with regard to defence and security issues in Canada and internationally. Looking here, CMSS is one of the leading centres of excellence in military and strategic studies in North America, and we focus on 4 themes of research. Theme one would be national security and defence. We also look at 21st century security, and at conventional and unconventional warfare and conflict. Another focus for our work is in the area of human rights development. So this is a critical, diverse, and incredibly important field of work. And it is my real pleasure to be able to hand off to Dr. Rob Hubert, who is the interim director of CMSS. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Rob, but in addition to being interim director, I wanted to say that Rob is also a professor in the Department of Political Science and has been an esteemed researcher with CMSS since the year 2000. So Rob, if you would care to take over here, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much.
It's always so great when one of your bosses says such nice things about you. I have to say bosses because there's about 3 or 4 bosses I have here sitting in the audience. Anyway, welcome. Thank you very much for coming. As the Dean has mentioned, the Centre sees itself as, of course, one of the leading elements of trying to engage Canadians on topics of security. We know that we are in a dangerous environment, and we know that the only way that we can have that proper understanding of defense, the only ability that we can rise to the occasion as we move into this much more dangerous international arena is by engaging with the Canadian population. We know that one of the challenges that we face is not only identifying the threats and dangers, and to that, of course, education is central to allowing us. And I acknowledge the many students that are here. I recognize many faces from our program that have taken the course and that are currently taking our program. And so thank you very much for taking the time above and beyond the lectures. I also want to acknowledge the various members of the military, both serving and retired, in terms of your engagement, your ability to provide with us your expertise. And I know that when it comes to the period of discussions, that of course your expertise adds so much to what we are doing. I also want to acknowledge that as successful as CMSS is today, we are standing, of course, as several people have always put it, standing on the shoulders of the giants. And so I take a pride in being able to take this leadership role, but I also want to acknowledge the very hard work of our former directors. We have 2 out of the 3 former directors here with us. David Burkeson, who of course was our founder, his vision, his insights, his efforts, of course, led us to where we are. The excellent work that then his successor, Erin von Brustad, who is also hiding there in the back there, and the work that she brought in terms of consolidating. The only individual that we're missing, of course, is Dr. Maureen Hebert, but I would also acknowledge just how much she has contributed. So thank you very much for taking the time for coming here. These issues are of our critical importance. This is, of course, our 3rd, and we will be having a 4th. I wanted to be able to share with you who that speaker is. We're still working that out, so just pay attention to however you found out about this one, and we will make sure that you are aware of who we have. I absolutely guarantee, keeping with the tradition, talking about the war in Ukraine, talking about the coming nuclear war, well, not coming nuclear war, but the new modern era of nuclear capabilities that we talked about last time. Today, when we talk about Russian misinformation, I guarantee you that we will have an equally interesting topic on that. Now, to that level, we are taping all of these talks. We are going to be posting them. We're just working out. Once again, one of the things when you're starting to do new things, sometimes things just take a little bit longer. We have the 2 previous talks that have been recorded. We will be putting them up on the university YouTube page, and we will also be putting this one up. So this is a public event. So stay tuned on that. Before I start talking about just what an amazing speaker we have, I also want to point out, for those of you that are interested in the workings of what we are proceeding on, come November, if you're interested in the Royal Canadian Air Force, we are currently preparing for a 2-day conference that will be open to the public, probably November, I think it's 14, 15, it's the Thursday and Friday of our reading week, in which we are trying to bring some of the most leading experts on Canadian air power, both historical and ongoing. We will be posting that as it goes. We are trying to develop research projects onto the Canadian Navy. I'll share that on our various webs that we have on that context. If you're interested in any of the forums that we have, we will be happy to have participation of individuals. And by the way, we're open for ideas. If any of you are listening to us, if any of you are saying, hey, you know what, you've had the Ukrainian war, you've had nuclear war, you've had the Russian misinformation, what else can, I know this neat subject, maybe you want to start talking about it. We are all ears. The only way that a community, and I see ourselves as a community, the only way that a community actually functions is when it's a two-way street of information. So please, please, please feel free to come up to us at any point and share ideas. If we can do it, we will do it. I mean, there's not everything that we can do, but we try our very best. Now, having said that, I'd now like to just talk a little bit about an introduction of our keynote speaker. Now, I have all the written notes, but I don't like reading notes. I think that it misses the essence of really what we're talking about. You are going to be hearing from the individuals. There's always sort of a beginning, a commencement, when the superstars of study start talking, and you go, oh, well, I saw Dr. Kissinger before he became a famous lecturer, or I saw Samuel Huntington give a talk when he was just coming out with his PhD. I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration when it comes to understanding misinformation programs that Dr. Boucher, who is both with the School of Public Affairs and with the Department of Political Science, he is Canada's, if not one of our leading experts on understanding. There's a lot of our academics that pretend to understand misinformation, but they limit their research to reading the newspaper and paying attention to what's on in terms. JC is doing the real thing when it comes to transdisciplinary examinations of how we come to terms with just how devious our enemies have been in terms of how they have actually engaged. And so that he's the real deal on this aspect. He's an outstanding academic, but of course, what isn't quite as well known, he's also a former a former officer within the Canadian Land Forces as well. So he has firsthand experience of what it feels in that particular context. Now, you're not possibly going to hear, there's a lot of us. You'll hear me, you'll hear Berkeson, you'll hear a bunch of us being on the media, being interviewed, a little bit of a persona. You're not going to hear JC's name quite so much, and it's not because he's not doing stuff that's on par or exceeds our stuff. It's because of the sensitivity of what he does. And so we are really privileged to have him come here and share his thoughts, share his ideas, because as far as those people that have an expertise of this in Canada, and I dare say within NATO, is very limited. And so therefore, indeed, I am really looking forward to seeing what he is able to share with us publicly. And so, JC, the floor is yours.
Awesome. All right, thank you, everyone. I should bring Rob all the time to all my talks everywhere. I think that would open the floor all the time. Thank you so much for the kind words. So I'm going to jump right into it. I have a lot of slides. So as you all know, the information space now is becoming more and more a battleground for modern state actors and non-state actors. Although we kind of underassume this, we're seeing these actors really investing a lot of resources and efforts to undermine, exploit, manipulate the information space in a way to advance their interest and undermine our interests. So much so that in some ways our adversaries, China, Russia, in some respects also non-state actors, are really at the forefront of those things. We spend a lot of time, especially in Alberta, complaining about the $1 billion we give to CBC. The Russian official budget for information, state-owned information outside of Russia is actually $3 billion. And that's the non-NATO number. The NATO number is actually higher and classified. So our adversaries are spending massive amounts of resources to try to shape the information space in a way that brings this forward. Democracies have been on the back foot on those issues, and we have not really addressed those issues as seriously as possible. Slowly but surely, we're trying to do this. We're trying to focus really on foreign information manipulation and interference. You hear a lot about Chinese disinformation in Canada. To be fair, we're working a lot with national defense and global affairs, tracking those people, and every week there's a new actors coming in and exploiting our information space, and we find out all sorts of new things. We're getting pretty good at understanding the Russians and how they operate and what they do, but not long ago we kind of still struggle to understand how the Chinese are developing the information space, and we're, in my team, building projects on this. But not long ago, the Indians did the same thing and really invested a lot of resources to shape the information space when the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, announced that, they had assassinated one Sikh Canadian in Canada. And then, of course, in the Hamas-Israel conflict right now, we're seeing Hamas affiliated groups that are also backed by Iran really exploiting the diasporas, exploiting the information space in a way that undermines this. To be fair, right now, in Canada and a lot of Western countries, we've conceded that space to our adversaries. We're not pushing back. We're not actually doing a lot on foreign interference. In some ways, we are not engaging in those. If we went to war tomorrow, there would be no way to prevent the adversaries to invest a lot of resources in our information space, try to shape Canadians' attitude and support for these conflicts. And in some respect, some of the things we see, and somehow they do have influence. In the United States, for example, for a long time, the Republican Party was supposedly the adult in the room on foreign policy, and especially on national defense. Today, if you listen to what the Republicans are saying, especially on the far right, and especially if you were with Tucker Carlson's yesterday, you'll see a lot of pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian views of policy, and a lot of people in Washington are scratching their heads and trying to think hard and fast about those things. So what I'm going to try to show you here is a little bit the studies we try to do. We work with NATO, we work with global affairs, we work with national defense, and we really try to kind of understand how the Russians are using the information space to express their narratives, how they shape their propaganda, and what do they say. Really, we're doing this to raise awareness on our hand on trying to understand how the Russians kind of structure this in their head, and really have a way to kind of normalize and formalize our own counter-narratives. Right now at NATO, there's an entire new field that we call NATO, like STRATCOM, strategic communication. There's an entire field of communicators, fighters, soldiers that are investing in their information space, trying to promote our values, our ideas, our interests, and really fight and counteract Russian propaganda. Right now in NATO, there's a new NATO structure. There's a J10 now in the NATO structure, which is essentially a STRATCOM component that is added to any commanding units and HQ. In Canada, we're very, 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 very far from even thinking and starting to do this. There's a document right now circling at D&D talking about a policy about how to be agile in the information space. It's not a thing. And there's no doctrine, no policies, no nothing. There's, like I've said, if we go to war tomorrow, see the information space being polluted by adversaries pushing misinformation, undermining and eroding our trust in institutions, and right now we have no way to kind of fight this on an even ground. I have a clicker. All right, so this is a study that we've done on trying to understand Russian propaganda. This is partly funded by money that we get from national defense to work on information warfare. And we've presented this at NATO and elsewhere. You're getting the better version. The generals at NATO got the draft. You're getting the after draft. All right, let's see. So the research puzzle. So what are we trying to do? So there's an argument in the literature trying to understand how the Russians are trying to shape their strategic communication. How are they weaponizing, formalizing their communication strategy in a way to undermine allies and undermine NATO support and erode trust in institution. There's a lot of arguments in the literature, and there's really a lot of confusion on how this is done. We kind of understand what Russian disinformation looks like. We've done a survey, for example, measuring misinformation in Canada, looking at COVID-19, climate change, social issues, and Russian disinformation. And of all these topics, Canadians can smell Russian propaganda better than all the other ones. So I think this is good on us. But we want to understand this better. There's also this argument that the Russians are like really trying to throw spaghetti at the wall. They're trying to do anything. They are not really strategic in how they engage in the information space. And we want to understand whether or not that's true. Are they just chaotic, trying to, sow dissent and really try any kind of narrative? Or do they have like a specific view of the world? And can we counteract? Of course, this is really the first part, and I see this always as recce, right? To understand and fight the enemy, you have to know where the enemy is and what they're doing and understand better their weapons. And this is kind of the process by which we go at this. We know, for example, that one thing that really aids and helps our adversaries in the information space is the rise of social media, of communications technologies, and automation and AI. Right now, in all across the world, all the countries are fighting and building up tools to create and generate AI on text, on audio, on video, on pictures. My team can do this, and we can create a fake, completely inauthentic disinformation campaign. And if my team can do it, believe me, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, they can do it way better and way faster and with bigger guns than we do. So the future of information and the future of the cognitive space in which we evolve is really in danger. The way we perceive this is really a question of cognitive sovereignty. Within states, we have, especially in democracies, we have this idea of free speech and deliberation on what policies and good policies are. If we have adversaries coming in our information space, trying to shape the discourse, trying to shape policies, trying to undermine the kinds of things we want to do, then we are losing our sovereignty over the way we think about issues. And in some ways, the adversaries are exploiting our weaknesses, and we have to understand this better. In this, social media platforms and the speed at which communication happens is really a key of allowing our adversaries to exploit that space. Not long before, we had like legacy media who kind of really controlled and were gatekeepers in information, and were allowing and really helping out on screening bad information from good information. It was really, really hard for adversaries to kind of pierce the legacy media part and engage with population. Today, Russian, Chinese, Indian, Iranians can invest a lot of resources in the information space, spread information through social media platforms, engage directly with Canadians without the state actually knowing it. Right now, in the government of Canada, there's no one really monitoring the information space. At Global Affairs, who's technically supposed to do this, there's the size of the people looking at Indo-Pacific disinformation is actually 3 people, and they're covering China, Iran, and India. And they were asked to cover the Hamas-Israel conflict because Indo-Pac is not Europe, so Middle East kind of fits. So in the grand scheme of things, we're not doing this. We're actually not monitoring this, and we're not doing anything against it. It means we're weak. It means that we're vulnerable. To be fair, even our senior leadership in the military are vulnerable to misinformation. Our troops are. They share things on social media. They engage. They go on convoy march. They undermine, really, the institution, and there's a really big need to do something about that. But really what we're trying to do here is really look at the social media space and whether or not and how our adversaries are using social media to kind of exploit this. So really the purpose of this is understand Russian strategic communication. How do they shape the way they think about issues? What kind of messages are they trying to advance? And whether or not we can find ways to counteract their narratives. There's a lot of questions about like the Ukraine war, whether or not it changed. I'll show you it did, how the Russians are doing this. And in this paper, what we've done is really look at Russian exploitation of Telegram. Who knows Telegram here? All right, so Telegram is a Russian platform. So right now, most of the social media platforms like Twitter, like Facebook, are owned by American companies and have all sorts of regulations and responsibilities in monitoring. Telegram is a platform that is built by Russians. It's a Russian company. It has no monitoring of anything. It has both a channel function and a messaging function. And what we are starting to see is that a lot of the Russians, the Iranians, are exploiting using Telegram as a way to advance their narrative. I was going to say the good thing about Telegram is that it's an end-to-end encryption, so technically it's really hard to really read anything. They can close down channels so that you can't get into, and what you're seeing right now is that a lot of the armies around the world, the Hamas, Iranians, the Ukrainians, the Russians are using Telegram as a way to filter, propagate their propaganda, engage with users. So we wanted to see whether or not the Russians were using Telegram and how were they shaping this. So what we've done is we've looked at Telegram and said, one of the problems we have in this space is attribution. How do we know that the Russians are actually saying this? How do we know that that propaganda comes from Moscow, the Kremlin? And it's really difficult. We know, for example, that the far right is engaged and is amplified by Russian disinformation, but we need a lot of intelligence, a lot of work to kind of backtrack this. We know that the far left, and I could tell you a couple of groups in Canada and the US who have direct ties to RT.com or Russian propaganda machines. But then again, attribution is difficult. In this project, what we want to do is really have a good sense of that kind of attribution. So what we've did is we start to look, one of my PhDs said, you know what, the Russian embassies in Canada have a Telegram account. We could look what they say. And we said, yeah, we could collect that. And then we figured out that there was such channel in Australia, in the US, in the UK, in France. And then we start to say, maybe we should look around the world. So what we did is we scraped their entire Telegram channels across the world. So we've built an API, a model to scrape all conversations the Russians are making or doing on their Telegram channels across the world. And that's what some of the data that I'm looking at you, presenting you. So what we've done is really this kind of big data approach to communication. All these embassies across the world are talking to someone, and we want to see how they've done it. So we scraped this. It's about 2 million comments, give or take. Of course, we're not going to read all of those. We could spend a lot of resources. So my team, what my team focuses on is really on what we call AI-assisted text analysis. What we do is we build AIs, we build artificial intelligence models to read these comments. We're not going to read them. And we build an AI to learn how to classify and read those for us and give us kind of a really boiled down version of this. So we've really built an AI to kind of read this. That AI is used in government and NATO right now. It's open source. There's no secret there. Anyone can build one. It's actually really easy to do. And then we're going to really kind of explain this. So this is the evolution of engagement on Telegram since 2017. So the good news is that when we actually dig into a Telegram channel, we can grab their entire conversation since the beginning of the account. So when the account is open and somebody posts in it, we get that. Some of these Telegram channels were open in 2021. Some of them go back to 2017. Tehran, Kazakhstan actually comes from 2017, which is very impressive because, the Canadian embassies don't even have Telegram account today. So as you can see here, you really have a long line of little activity, and the Russians are actually not really using a lot of those Telegram accounts. There's a bit of blip, and I'll show you that blip. And then, surprisingly, in February 2022, there's a huge spike of online activity. All these Telegram accounts across the world start to activate at the same time. What we're really seeing here is that prior to the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the Russians somehow started to build all of these Telegram accounts and all these embassies around the world. We have 134 embassies. And in February 2022, all of them activated at the same time, which is impossible to do organically. What we see here is really a directed, purposeful attempt to shape the information space and where they are. They're using these accounts to bolster their narrative about the Ukraine war and engage with people in different countries in different ways. Which is really interesting to see really how the Russians are really tagging this information component to all their operations. In Canada, we don't do that at all. We don't have any STRATCOM capacity. When we send ships to the Pacific, they do what they call like Navy diplomacy. They stop somewhere, they bring officials, they drink, and then they go to another port, and then they do the same thing. But there's no information operations trying to shape the message. NATO does this now. If you can see, the Canadians are going to operate in an exercise soon. The NATO right now has a STRATCOM component that has roughly 4 big messages, but 2 that are very, very focused. One is deterrence, and the other one is assurance. So for every exercises that NATO does now, there's a STRATCOM component. There's an entire group at Bronson that sits down and says, the commander wants to show these capabilities. How do we shape a message that advances our strategic communication? And they have 2 purposes. Deterrence, they want the Russians to know. They're not trying to be coy. They're not trying to hide things. They're not trying to be, really trying to hide from the Russians. They're really at the Russians all the time. They're making sure that whatever they're doing, the Russians know. And on the back end, they take all the information from the Five Eyes and everything they can get from the Russians and read their material and whether or not the Russian intelligence units actually talk about the exercise. What they really want to know and what they really want to do is tell the Russians, look at all these capabilities we have. We can drop ships. We can, bomb things. If ever you mess with us, this is what's going to happen to you. And they're making sure that the Russians know. And their entire communication strategy is directed at that. The second part is that they want to assure allies. A lot of countries, the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, are unsure sometimes on whether or not NATO will come to their aid. So a lot of the communication that they're doing is not only making sure that the Russians know that they're actually there and they have a capacity to actually engage them, but also making sure that NATO allies, especially our small partners, actually know that NATO will come to their aid. And they're really, it's in the war plans. In Canada, there's no such things. We just send ships and hope that they come back. So the Russians are doing this, NATO is doing this, but we can see how the adversaries are really including the information space into their military operations. So of course, we're not going to read all of those, and we want to classify really how we're going to do this. So here this is an AI. It's essentially a deep learning application to text analysis. We take a foundation model from BERT that's been trained on trillions of pages on internet, and then we retrain it with our own data set out of our Telegram channel, and then it classifies text for us and reads it for us. We can talk longer if you want, but usually that's not the slide that people like. So that's what it does. That's the math. Okay, so we can go back to this. So really what we're trying to do here is how do we understand strategic communication? So the theory says that to do good strategic communication, you have to really focus on 3 big types of narratives, 3 big objectives. On the one hand, you should have strategic objective where you tag big arguments about your strategic position in the world. And there should be, in your strategic communication, a really focused argument and narrative about what you do in the world. In Canada, we don't really have a lot of strategic objectives on anything. We don't see the government of Canada going abroad saying, like, we want to do X, and this is how we're going to do, and we're sending ships to deter China, and hey, China, we're adding you, look at our ships, how they're still sailing, and we're making sure that we're there for you. So really, strategic kind of objectives talks about the place of the state in the world, how they understand, the distribution of power, and there needs to be an argument about that. Operational objectives are more narratives centered on the actual, place of the country in a specific operation, and really looks at a special war. If we were sending ships in Asia, for example, and we would tag a STRATCOM component to our operations in the Indo-Pacific, we would have a strategic objective. We're there to support our allies and blah, 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 and rule of law. And then we would have an operational, we're going to Singapore and Tokyo and Japan because we're doing X and Y, and it really kind of boils down to the operation. And then at the tactical level, we're really looking at the war itself and moving the strategic communication at the war level. This is important. I always say this, NATO and countries like ours are learning a lot from what the Ukrainians are doing in Ukraine. And beyond just bombing and fighting drones and fighting tanks, they're also really good at strategic communication. All these images you see on social media, all their engagement with foreign actors, all their Zelensky videos, their packaging and showing all of this is with purpose. In Ukrainian units now, there's STRATCOM elements. The Ukrainians go to war with their weapons, but also with GoPros, and they take footage of what they're doing. And if they're lucky enough to come back to the unit, they dump all this footage to a person who's responsible for strategic communication. That person takes all the footage, scrapes it from operational security and all of those, and then sends them back to their battalion, which then posts them online and create a narrative around this. Okay, the Ukrainians want to say, like, we want to make sure that, people know that the Russians are committed war crimes. Any footage that kind of demonstrate this, we're making sure to put this in place. It fits within our, operational objectives, and we do this. They have a plan, they have a procedure, they do this all the time. I'm telling always now the Canadian Armed Forces, we train people to shoot with C7s, but we have to train them now to be STRATCOM warriors and engage in information space and be part of the online narrative because it's a big part now of modern warfare. So really what we wanted to do is kind of like structure Russian strategic communication in kind of those three categories. What did they say at the strategic level, and how do they engage on that? What did they say on the operational level? How did they talk on this? And what did they say at the tactical level, and what did they say on that? And for sure, if you're starting to do counter-narrative, then you actually know what you're fighting, and you're actually trying to catch the narrative that the Russians are saying. That sounds clear to me. All right. So a good example of this, right? So for example, strategic objectives usually talks about geopolitical situation, and here, we can talk about the shifting and shaping of the global order. The Russians often talk about how, they've lost their power status in the world. The reasons why they're doing the things they're doing is to kind of fight back the West and reclaim their lost status in the international order. They complain and moan about how the rest of the world haven't taken them seriously, and now they're reacting with their neighbors to make sure that they're doing this. Their argument all the time is not that they're in war in Ukraine. They say we're fighting the Americans, we're fighting NATO, which I find always ironic because if they were fighting NATO, they wouldn't be around. But for sure the Russians are kind of shaping this. You'll hear even in Canada, even university professors will say, the reason why, Russia is in Ukraine is because, NATO expanded eastward, which is really what a Russian would say. Operational objectives really focuses on trying to undermine support in specific countries and try to undermine really the relationship that NATO countries have. The Russians, one of Russia's objective is not only undermine and erode our trust in our own democracy, and they're doing that. They're amplifying anti-LGBTQ narratives. They're amplifying our division on indigenous relations. They're doing all of those not because they really care about the LGBTQ people. It's because they know that it's a trigger point for us and creates dissension, divisions in our society. And whatever chaos they can find and whether lack of consensus they can find, then they're very happy for themselves. For example, the Russians, funded and amplified environmental groups in Germany against nuclear power. When Fukushima happened, the Germans realized they had a lot of nuclear plants. They freaked out, and the Russians funded a lot of these environment groups that undermined this. They shut down all of their nuclear power. Today in Germany, you can't talk about nuclear power. And what they got out of this is Germany drunk on Russian gas. It was a perfect strategic communication strategy, undermining and using, environmental groups in Germany to push their objective. Of course, Russia wants to do this for us. They do this inside our states, but they do this also within the NATO alliance. They try to push Hungary and Turkey in certain ways. You're looking at the drama right now with the acceptance of Finland and Sweden into NATO. A lot of those tractation comes with Hungary trying to hold on. The Russians are behind, making sure that these things are not done in a way. If they can undermine the alliance, if they can undermine our cohesion, then that fits their interests. And at the tactical level, they talk about the Ukraine war. Regime change, denazifying, why are we in Ukraine, what do we do in Ukraine, and really doing this. So we've trained an AI to read these three kinds of narratives. And this is exactly a timeline of all of those. The blue line is really operational arguments. It's when the Russians are in their Telegram accounts are talking about NATO undermining their support. The red line is more their strategic narrative, trying to promote the view that Russia is really trying to regain its status in the world, and it's the United States and NATO countries are the bad people in the world order. And the green line is really Ukraine talks. What we see here is that in their Telegram account, in their embassies, they're really emphasizing their strategic goals and they're really emphasizing their operational goals. They almost don't talk a lot about Ukraine. When they engage with people in different countries, they're really focusing on either blaming the United States or NATO or pushing their operational objectives. Here's a comparison of different countries. So we have 134 countries. It's a bigger data set that we don't know what to do with it, to be fair. And right now I have students like taking Africa and taking Asia and kind of looking at different kinds of regions because there's just too much data. This is only a comparison of the big countries. So we have the United States, Australia, India, France, Canada, and the UK. Essentially. And you can see how the distribution of how they talk about these issues actually changes according to the actors. And we find this fascinating because it tells us something about how the Russians are actually engaging. What we find here is that the Russians are actually moving the narrative based on the country they're doing so, which tells us that not only are they trying to promote their strategic communication on a global scale, but they tailor this by country, which tells you that they have somewhat a sense of what objectives they're trying to achieve in each country. In the United States, they talk about strategic competition against the United States. They focus on the issue, the United States are bad people. They're focusing on their international conflict with each other, and they really underscore the other ones. In Australia, they focus a little bit on strategic, a little bit on operational. In India, they focus a lot on operational stuff, talking about India itself. What we see in the Indian online engagement is that the Russians are actually telling the Indians, we're actually friends. We're actually, we understand that you're not part of the West. We can be the trusted partner that will fight against the rest. And they play this argument of them being different than the West. In France, they do the same thing. I'll show you the France data. Canada, and then the UK embassy. What I find really interesting is that when the Russians talk about strategic goals, they really focus on the UK and the US. And if you think in terms of Russians, those are the big two adversaries really in the world. They really don't care about Canada. They don't care about France. But really when they engage with serious adversaries, they really focus on those kinds of issues. This is a comparison between the US embassy and the French embassy. And we've presented this to the French government. And when we look, we found two things. The first part is that before the war in Ukraine, most of their comments, most of their engagement on the French and on the US channels were in Russian. So they were using these Russian embassy telegram as a way to engage with Russian nationals. February 2022, they switched to French or English. So they're really modifying the way they use the Telegram accounts to focus really on engaging with their population, and that becomes a channel of strategic communication. And that's really, when you see the data, they switch, all their channels switch to the local language. In Hindi, in Thai, in Japanese, they drop the Russian, and then they focus on English, French, or whatever language they can activate, which makes sense if you're trying to communicate your views and try to promote your narrative in countries, you'll do it in the language of a country. What we also see here is that they focus a lot in the French data into operational stuff. And what we find this is a lot of, to be fair, flattery language of the French. In the data, there's almost no adversarial or toxic conversations. When you look at the US, it's all like the US are bad, you're corrupted, you accept the LGBTQ. They do that a lot in Canada. And it's really kind of this, vinegar relationship, right? And they want to know that, you're our adversaries. In French, it's all honey. It's all, the French and the Russians are great cultures. We have a long history of engaging together. There's a lot of arguments about, we know you're not really NATO. We know that we have a better relationship, and you're like, you also struggle with American dominance in Europe, and we feel you, we're like BFF. And to be fair, when I listen to the French, a lot of French, I was going to say intellectuals, let's say a lot of French people, and some in government and in the military, they have this discourse. They push back always on the Canadians, say like, why are the Canadians so hard on the Russians? You just don't understand them properly. They just want to invade countries and be respectful. If we respect them more, then they'll be like more nice. Canadians, being influenced by a strong, history of Ukrainians and Poland who have a long history of engagement with Russian, will say like, that's never the case. But whatever the Russians are doing in France really is echoed in the government and in the military. And every time I go there every year, 2 or 3 times a year, I engage with their senior leadership, and I get always this pushback. And I say like, yeah, that's what a Russian would say. They don't like that comment. So what we're starting to do is really starting to compare and contrast the way they shape their narrative by country. We find that there is a lot of commonalities between channels. We think, and we see, for example, that sometimes they share the same content, their same like HTTPs or URLs, or like here's a Lavrov comment, and then they all share it. So we know that Moscow somehow telegraphs and says, all the embassies, here's today's Telegram channel. And then they go off script. And it seems like some people in these embassies have some capacity to structure, manage, tailor the narrative to each countries and really engage in those things. And we find this really fascinating. The contrast between the French and the Americans is really good. In the UK, it's the same. So this is So this is just, so like I've said, we started to kind of scrape the entire world. And the reason was we wanted to start to compare where do they put resources. In some ways, we can look at how they engage with these countries differently, and we can say this is where the Russians are actually putting efforts. In countries where there's not a lot of posting, they don't actually care. The embassy is not really engaged on Telegram, and it's not a key environment. Where they're very active, this is where we know that the embassy somehow has more staff, but also has a vested strategic interest in that country, and they spend time and money on strategic communication. This is just Africa and Southeast Asia. And as you can see, they are very active in strategic places. They're active in Algeria. They're active in Egypt. They're active in, that's Kenya. They're active in South Africa. And they're active in Senegal. When you're the French, and this is something that the French have learned now, is that the Russians were eating their lunch on the strategic communication point. As the French were going to Mali to try to stabilize the country, the Russians just came in with Wagner, but also with their embassies, and built an entire strategic communication campaigns that undermined the entire French operation, so much so that they had to essentially shut it down and leave. Now today, the French are building a stratcom basically on that. They're saying, like, we got screwed in Mali. We know now that the information space is actually capital to some of the operations. We're not going to get screwed again. But I could have told them that like a year ago or 2 years ago with that data. It's like, they're spending a lot of time in Algeria. What are they doing in Senegal? Looking at Southeast Asia, what do we see? Look, so you don't see Singapore, but Singapore is actually a big blob. They're spending most of their money into Singapore and Cambodia, which is interesting. I actually don't know why Cambodia, and one of my students is actually just looking at Russian Telegram engagement in the Indo-Pac region. But really, they're spending the money differently elsewhere. This is a map of African and Southeast Asia engagement on Telegram. There's almost nothing before February 2022, and they all activate at the same time. That's a lot of resources. That's a lot of purpose and direction. What do we find also? That little green thing. So they were active in the little green thing. Anyone know what that is? And it's too small for you guys to read. What do you think?
Maldives.
Say again?
Maldives.
That could be it, but no, it's an African country.
Oh.
Where have the Russians really been active in Africa? South Africa. They were active in South Africa way before the Ukraine war. They were engaging with the population, and you're right, the South Africans are actually supporting somewhat the Ukraine war, and have been very critical of the Western support for Ukraine. Yeah?
Was it related to Wagner's activities in South Africa?
Yeah. But what we find here is that it's really surprising that it's the only one that activates, right? So the Russians are doing something in South Africa way before the other embassies are doing it. We weren't on the ball at that time, but they probably learned a lot of their strategic communication, how to use this at that time. This is the entire world. We have more than 129 because some of those are doing it. So if you really look at how they're directing their resources, they're really active in Kazakhstan, which makes sense. They're really active in Germany, in Japan, in Myanmar, in all of those countries that they have their vested interests. And our next project is actually to dig down in those pressure points, because it tells us not only what the Russians are saying, but where they're putting resources and what they're doing in the world in a much more kind of structured and scientific way to go about it. I find this always awesome. Right now, we're actually scraping Twitter because the embassies also have Twitter accounts, so we're looking if the Twitter and the Telegram accounts match and see if they're saying the same thing. And if they do, then that means they have a multi-platform strategic communication campaign, which is, yeah. That's what $3 billion built by. So what are my conclusions? So we can start to think about Russian strategic communication as really trying to push either strategic, operational, or tactical narratives. And slowly but surely, they're a lot more organized and disciplined than someone would think. They're not throwing spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. They really have a template, they have a screenplay, and they follow this, and they try to advance different things. They all activate at the same time, which tells you that the Kremlin actually has a plan and has a communication plan of how they're doing their things. This can't be organic in any shape or form. So somehow, somewhere, there's a unit in Moscow that does just that. We also see that they change the way they have these conversations with different countries, trying to push different kinds of narratives. That scares me a lot, because it tells me that they have a much deeper, nuanced understanding of the audiences they're trying to engage with than what we think. This is not just dumb Russian information operation. This is really targeted. We know what the French want. We understand them. We're going to push those things because that's going to bring our objective. We also know out of this data that they're spending their resources in different places and different where. We don't see all these embassies saying the same thing at the same time. No, they put a lot of effort in Senegal, in Algeria, in Cambodia, Singapore, in Japan. They have really focused interests in different countries, and they don't spend a lot of resources in those they don't have any countries, which tells you that this is not organic, this is really strategic, which tells you that the Russians are really in front and way better than we are at this, unfortunately. That's it. Any questions?
So we are now proceeding.
Yeah. This one.
We are now going to proceed to the question period of this participation. And so I would ask you to wait till Mary comes by with the mic, because again, we are making sure that everybody can hear the questions, and we are recording it to be subsequently posted on the university's YouTube strategy. So at this point, we'll welcome questions, and Mary will come and recognize. So who's going to be first? Sir. And please identify yourself, too.
If you want to.
If you
don't
want
have to.
Hi there, I'm Jonah. I'm actually a graduate of the history program at U of C, and soon to be law graduate as well as a Bachelor of Education graduate. So I love going to school at the University of Calgary, at least until I get a job. Anyways, so my question is obviously this is an interesting algorithm, like developing all this data. To what extent would you say that this information is kind of reflecting what's being, like the general consensus that already exists, maybe without social media? And to what extent can this actually like influence like the change of public opinion in these jurisdictions?
It's a very good question. It was enough for people to drive trucks from Prince George to Ottawa and stay there for 3 weeks. It's shaping narratives way more than you think. We're doing, like, with Aaron Gibbs von Brunschut, we've done a study on Russian disinformation. We see, for example, all sorts of things. We see that young Canadians actually have a harder time identifying misinformation than older Canadians. So I know, like, all the gray hair are like, yeah. My assumption at that, and my hypothesis at that time, knowing how my dad is really bad at social media, was like, it's like older folks who have a hard time adjusting to the modern information space. What we find, it's not that. What we find is that, in fact, younger Canadians who are using social media a lot more have a harder time identifying truth on all sorts of issues, and that's a concern. We have all sorts of data that shows more and more that, especially for younger people, their online personalities and identity align with their their real life personalities, and we're seeing those who participate more online on political issues, on social issues, also participate more in real life. For my dad's generation, that's not true, but the older this generation gets and all the young people coming in, it's coming more and more. And there's a lot of studies, other parts, that shows, for example, that Instagram has a massive impact on young girls' self-esteem and all of those. So we know now that the information space is really multi-platform, multimodal. There's images, there's audios. And in the grand scheme of things, all of these things on aggregate really matters a lot more now than the assumption we had with legacy media. The last part is that a lot of the studies we've done on legacy media, on the impact of media on national defense, always had this kind of view that, borders, that the media landscape is like constrained to borders, and we have this view of a closed box, right? We're going to look at the Canadian media. That's not true anymore. Fox News has way more impact on Canadians' views on political issues than we might really assume. And I would almost dare to say, given my dad, how he sends me stuff, that it has more impact on the right than the National Post does. And so we're starting to see this influence more and more, radicalization online. And we're really behind. We have a lot of our time. This is actually pretty hard to do. We have to build models. We have to do AI. We have to do this in real time. It requires a lot of effort, a lot of technical expertise. My team has that, but I have a big team. I got a lot of funding, and that allows me to do that kind of work. At National Defense, they can't do that. They actually can't. At NATO, they're building that team, but they're gonna provide. NATO Stratcom right now will issue a multi-billion-dollar contract to do just that. It's gonna be like Microsoft or whatever. It's gonna take that. Global Affairs has 3 people. They're reading tweets and channels. They're not doing that. So we're catching up. I'd say political parties are actually better at doing this than big countries, if it's, or it's it's hidden in intelligence. So intelligence units have this, but it's the worst place to put that because in anyone who ever worked in intelligence, there's a monkey at the door with a stamp. And it just stamps everything top secret. So for every document that comes in, there's like a stamp on it, so nobody ever sees the light of it. And so all of this work gets anywhere.
Hey there, I'm Sam Warren. I'm a software engineer with the BC government. I had a question about how you collected the data that you used in your study, because end-to-end encryption, as you know, means that not even Telegram is supposed to know what the contents of that message is. Did you have cooperation with the embassies to retrieve these plain text messages? Or?
So there's 2 answers to this. On Telegram, there's open channels and closed channels. The closed channels, you need the administrator to come and let you in. There's adversarial scraping that can be done on those, but you need a research ethics approval, and all. We don't do that. All of these are actually open. So the API is just there to grab. It's public data. So we can scrape it. And, the code is not that complicated. I mean, to be fair, we're scraping also YouTube, Reddit, TikTok. There's all sorts of ways to, even Tinder and Bumble you can scrape. The API is open.
Maybe in the spirit of your father, explain what scraping is.
So essentially, an API is your key to access a platform. So the platform gives you a key, and you write a code, and that allows you essentially to go on the platform and collect the data in real time or remotely. So you just build a code essentially, and you say, I want all this data from that time to that time. In that case, which we essentially say, we know what the Russian Telegram channels are. We just say, we want all the data in this channel, and then we dig. We're doing this on the far right. We're grabbing all their channels. All of this is open, and it's legal. I mean, if you really want to, if you think in terms of a Russian strategic communication, doing this behind a closed Telegram channel doesn't fit your purpose, right? Because you want people to know. So they let it open, so they don't hide. But there's a way to do adversarial scraping.
Thank you.
My name is Derek. Is your study focused strictly on Russian propaganda, or are you looking at the propaganda machines of other large countries, particularly the U.S. south of us?
So we have also projects looking at far-right American information operations, and we're looking also at Chinese. But not this way. I mean, the interesting part is that the information space is really, and the information ecosystem really is different by country. So you can't go at it the same way, and you can't assume that the techniques you're using to scrape the information space of pro-Russian narrative will be the same one for pro-Chinese. The pro-Chinese are not using Telegram that much, but Hamas is. So it really depends on the adversaries. The pro-Chinese are focusing mostly on WeChat, Weibo, and they use a lot of the Canadian Chinese media, and they try to access the diaspora more so than legacy media. It's just a different approach. The Iranians are the same. They go through the diaspora, so they do this in Farsi. So it requires us different ways of doing this, different ways of collecting data. It requires not only the technical skills, but also a linguistic skill. People who speak Mandarin, who can code, in Mandarin. It's a lot of work. But you're right. I'm equal opportunity against bullies.
What would you say the main platforms for the Americans are then?
So that's a good question. They move around. So Telegram for sure. Twitter a little bit. Facebook somehow. We're looking also at podcasting. So one of the area of expansion in the information space is podcasting. It depends on the platform. Some platforms are very active in content monitoring. Some are not at all. So for example, Twitter before Elon Musk was trying to find a way to keep things somewhat on even keel. Today it's not. They're very active on YouTube. So it depends. It really depends. It depends on the actors. It depends on the influencers. The far left is different than the far right. It's a lot of things to bring to the table. And the last part I want to say is that the challenge also is that more and more really modern communication, enterprises are multi-platform. So you have to have a YouTube, Telegram, Twitter, and they all do this at the same time. We see this a lot on Telegram, where sometimes they use these channels as a way to redirect people like from channel to channel, so they bounce around, and you have to kind of dig them out through those. But we're trying to do this, but it's already kind of a lot of work to build these AIs for multi-language like we're doing, then doing audio and video. It's a lot of techniques, but it's fun to do. Like, I like this space. It changes every time. And with generative AI today, that's going to move way faster. Way faster.
We have two here and two here, so go ahead, man.
Hi, Cynthia here. Your perspective on a lack of strategic cohesiveness in a lot of where Canada does stuff, how do you apply the example of the work that's going on in Latvia to that perspective?
That's interesting. So I go to Latvia every year. They do have a StratCon component in Latvia. They have one or two officers. They're more serious about it. The Latvians themselves are more serious about that, and they are building those capabilities a lot more. So I would qualify everything I've said, and I say except in Latvia. And Latvia is kind of this small ecosystem that does a little bit. A lot of the officers that come back to Canada are often frustrated because they see what they can do in Latvia, and they're like, I can't do this in Canada. I can't even tag a StratCom strategy to what we do in the Navy or whatever. So it's a little bit like Afghanistan. Afghanistan allowed you to do a lot of things that you can't do. And in some respect, today, we've regressed from Afghanistan years. In Afghanistan, we had these laptops or these these iPads, and you could actually, in the field, we don't have those anymore. In Latvia, they don't, so they took it away. So we kind of regress in terms of capabilities. The Latvians are better. To be fair, the East European countries are a lot more on the ball in this. I'd say Taiwan too. The Taiwanese, and I go to Taiwan regularly, and we're learning a lot from what they're doing and how they're thinking about this. They're a lot more aggressive in the information space. Somehow the Canadians are still complacent. We still hope that this problem would go away. We'll get burned, and then I'll qualify this. We also, because of our lack of policies and doctrine and everything on the information space, we also make mistakes. So for example, you probably heard like a long time ago where a reserve unit had like create a fake wolf event in New Brunswick, anyway, in the Maritimes. Why? Because there was a lack of oversight. So the reserves are like, hey, I can do like an information operation out of the exercise, which was a terrible idea. Recently, within the Canadian Armed Forces, far right narrative was shared within the commanding units without qualification of what that was. Some of those far right groups promote sometimes Russian narratives. And so we're having conversations with the National Defense saying, like, you guys are actually spreading Russian disinformation in your own environment. So not doing anything right now kind of creates weaknesses and vulnerabilities that we have. It's not a good space. Sorry.
This is Justin. I'm the MLA for Cypress Medicine Hat. You answered part of my question with your last two sentences there, so I'll kind of shift my question a bit if you don't mind. Given the extent of this, how far ahead would you say the Russians are in regards to years ahead of our STRATCOM here in Canada? I know we don't have one, but I'm just...
Wow. No,
essentially, if we were to start tomorrow or tonight at approximately 8:18.
Yes. All right. So we don't have any STRATCOM capabilities. So the Russians are basically owning the field completely. What I would say is that within national defense, within the government of Canada, and to be fair, within the GOA too, there is all sorts of people around with those kinds of understanding the urgency of the thing. And if tomorrow you said, JC, we need to build one, we could probably do this in 3 months and have a real unit of people who actually know what they're doing, who were trained in Latvia, who have deep expertise on Russian disinformation, on Chinese disinformation. We could do it. We can technically do it. We have none of the laws, none of the doctrine, none of the policies to actually do this. And my problem is that my interpretation of this is that there's a lack of leadership, like political leadership, willingness to actually put this in place. As soon as you start to talk about information operations, everybody start to freak out in Ottawa, and we don't do anything. And I understand, like, to be fair, all Western countries are going through all this drama, right? How to navigate free speech versus defending your information space, right? And how do you do this? How do you push back against foreign actors? It's a very delicate balance, and we haven't done it. Some countries like Australia, like France, somewhat the US, hope that the platforms will do it. Like, we'll let the platforms monitor the information space, and they're going to solve our problem. It doesn't work that way. Even if we did regulate the platforms, like the EU are doing it, but I'd say what I find interesting is that, so some countries are starting to build those. In France, for example, they had nothing, and now they have units. They're starting to build that. The Americans just published, if you want to Google it, their information operations strategy like 2 months ago, which brought together all their PsyOps and cognitive ops into one branch, and they're really kind of speeding up things. So the Chinese, the Russians, Hamas is, to be fair, better than Israel at this. And there's conversations with different colleagues with IDF, and the IDF are trying to build that up.
May I ask a supplement?
Oh, yeah.
A long-term hypothesis I've had is in regards to foreign players playing on our social media platforms, if you will. There seems to be this growing alignment that we capture something that very closely aligns to our beliefs, and we immediately shut down and assume that that's accurate regardless of its accuracy. And this is something that seems to affect both sides of the spectrum. And I find it predominantly, and maybe you can correct me, and this is where my question's going, I find it predominantly a very American thing. And I don't mean the US in America. I mean like North America, South America, and kind of everything in between. Now, with that, is that really where the Russians are attacking predominantly, or is it that they're going in a completely different direction with disinformation?
That's a great question. I think they're exploiting that. So, I think your assessment is right. They're, because of the polarization and political discourse that we have right now, it's really difficult to find consensus on things. It's normal as a society to go through this drama, and it's okay as a society to find a path that we think collectively is okay. But the Russians are actually pressing all our buttons. They know this. We actually see it. They amplify, for example, they know which far-right groups to amplify, and they do that. They don't even need to co-opt these people. There's a good example is Tucker Carlson. He promotes on his platform pro-Russian views, and it undermines Republican support for Ukraine. I've never seen any data, either classified or not classified, that shows that Tucker Carlson has connections with the Russians. I've never seen that. But for sure, the Russians are amplifying what he says. So they don't need they don't need to tell him what to say. They just have to find things they like. So in the BLM movement, for example, in the US, they don't tell the BLM movement what to say. They just amplify it. Oh, well, people hate each other around these issues. Let's make sure that they really hate each other. And I think as a democracy, that's my greatest concern. Especially right now, political discourse is fraught on both sides. And having actors exploiting those things is a issue. It's difficult to have this conversation. It's really difficult. I don't know how political actors and people who work as politicians actually do it. But they do. It's very difficult. And all of them are using different things, right? So the Chinese are mostly using the diaspora to pressure things, right? The Iranians are doing the same thing. Hamas has both. I think we haven't adapted yet. The Russians are in front. And I think that the offense, in military studies, we also about offense, defense balance, right? That sometimes the technology favors the offense, and this is where you get a lot of war. And then when the defense, is favorable, then people start to think twice about getting to war. The offense technologies on information warfare is better than the defense. That's what I would say right now. So to be on the offensive, it's actually better. From our perspective, it's really hard. Even from NATO's perspective, we're more active, is that we have values that they're things we won't do in strategic communication, right? We don't want to lie. We don't want to deceive people. We have different kinds of values about how we go engage in the strategic communication space. So we're kind of fighting with a hand. It would be way easier to build an entire disinformation campaign. That would be way easier than actually fighting on that space. It's a good question. Perfect.
Hi, I'm Eric. So loud?
I know, right? I feel the same way this way.
I don't need it. You'd referenced CBC at the beginning and Russian state television. $1 billion from the federal government to CBC, 2 to 3 billion to Russian state government. What's the difference of, how that money's
Spent?
how the money's being spent? And I guess
So the $3 billion is actually for their external communication. So it's not even what they spend inside the house. So that's what they spend to talk to you. Like CBC doesn't do that. We don't have an external service of communication at all. Like in the world, what BBC, Le Monde, like there's a couple of those. So there's a big difference because the Russians are using these channels, RT, Sputnik, World, in different languages to really engage with foreign audiences. In some ways, they have a complete control over their information space. It's very difficult for NATO countries, even Canadians, anyone, to do and talk and influence the information space of the Russians. Same thing with the Chinese. Like, it's very hard to do that. Because of our openness, that happens. With CBC, we have a lot of different other channels and partners in the Canadian information space, from far left to far right, that challenge CBC's views and have this conversation on issues. So there is somewhat a marketplace of ideas. Russia Sputnik has one specific objective: promote Russian views, undermine the West. And all of their content is designed that way in multiple languages.
We have time for, unfortunately, just 2 more questions. We have this lady here and the gentleman in the white with a question. We will have, of course, time to meet informally with JC after, but just we have to be mindful of the time that we're at. You know, unfortunately, this is the problem of bringing such outstanding speakers on these issues. Anyway, ma'am?
Well, I'll be very quick. Hi, I'm Flora, and I'm current student of the School of Public Policy. You mentioned that you go to Taiwan every year, and Taiwan has a robust STRATCOM system. So the presidential election was just this month, and we all know like China had a lot of misinformation, and Taiwan's trying to counter that. And I was just curious because you had that map of like the Russian Telegram activities.
Yeah.
Were there any spike in activities leading up to the election, or they just didn't really care and just let Taiwan and China fight it out?
So there's a Taipei channel. You're right. There's no embassies in Taipei. There's a channel. The answer is no. Mostly because like we would have to do this in real time, but you're right. One of the questions we have is Hamas-Israel war. So whether or not they're using this as a way to promote those wars, and how are the Russians positioning themselves? One of the big questions I have in my head, and this some of my students are working on, is in the Indo-Pacific information space, how does Russia navigate China's sphere of influence? For them, navigating in Europe is sort of easy. They know Europeans, and they can push Europeans around because that's part of their MO. In the Indo-Pacific, that's very different. And I'm wondering whether or not they're threading lightly with China and making sure either participating to Chinese, information ops or sharing things. We see China appearing in the data on Asia. We know that the Russians talk about China in Indo-Pac. We just don't know yet how they're negotiating this. One of the things we've learned slowly but surely is that Chinese information operations are sometimes aiding Russian disinformation. There is more and more an alignment on how China shapes its narrative about Ukraine, about Russia, than there used to be before the war. Before the war, the MO was the Russians and the Chinese have really different interests. The Chinese really want to focus on, the South China Sea environment and engages with the diaspora, and really don't try to do anything else. And the Russians will do the disinformation part and everything, especially in Western countries, or they're going to try to promote their views in African or Global South. Now these things are less real. They're moving together more and more and more and overlapping. My partners in Taiwan, for example, show how the way China now talks about Russia has changed dramatically, and it's more and more in line with the way the Russians are talking about issues, the fight against the West, the corrupt West, that China and Russia are offering an alternative to corruptions, and so we're seeing that, but more research. It's always like the thing, right? Like I'm not I'm not a finder, I'm a researcher, so there's always things to research.
Okay, we have time for one last question, and as I said, we will have the ability to engage with JC after if you still like. You can stick around for a little bit, right, JC? All right. Sir, last question.
Hello, my name is Parth. I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Calgary in International Relations and Political Science. My question for you is, how does joint interoperability play into NATO Stratcom when different members have varying commitments to Stratcom efforts?
Man, we don't even have a Stratcom in every nation in NATO, so interoperability is like nil and zero. But you're right, that's a big question, right? Once you start to have a J10, that forces NATO countries to start to build Stratcom capabilities. Or countries say, screw that, we're not doing this. And they can do it. But you're right, as a group, then what happens then, right? Is American Stratcom aligning with Canadian Stratcom? What does that look like? Even if we wanted to do Stratcom with, Navy diplomacy in the Indo-Pac, would we coordinate with the Americans, with the UK, with our Japanese allies? There's a lot of things that we have to talk about on those issues. And it's very complicated. Right now, at the G7, there's supposed to be what they call a rapid response mechanism, which tells you nothing. But it's really the G7's response to foreign information manipulation and interference. They're sharing information about strategies, about campaigns. For example, the Australian right now are really strong, and they're really good at Chinese disinformation. And they're the ones sometimes telling the Canadians, hey, look, the Chinese are actually, spamming your airware on those kinds of things. So there's collaboration at the G7 level. The teams are super small. Canada's team on the RRM, it may be 11, 15 people. The United States have an entire Stratcom group. They have also global engagement at their State Department level. They have some of these capabilities. They're better than we are, but they also have more bodies to put toward that problem. But everyone is talking about it. Everybody's thinking about how do we put this in place, but we're nowhere near having conversation about interoperability. Right now, to be fair, we're looking at the Ukrainians. Hey, what can we grab from the Ukrainians? We're looking at what the Russians are doing. What can we grab? What can we do? What works? What doesn't? How do we know what we're doing? How do we measure this? How do we build the information analysis to allow us to do this properly? It's a fun space, right? It doesn't exist. It's like creating completely a new discipline, a new branch out of thin air. And we need to professionalize it. So it's those who are who have maybe military experience, there's always an info ops person in a unit, and it's always a captain, and that captain is very old. And there's always we have a course in Borden about info ops, but it's a 2-week thing, and then we can do this. A lot of people who have deep knowledge about communication find that commanders often have an overinflated understanding of their capacity to communicate stuff. They're I don't need your advice on strategic communication. I'm a great communicator. People like me. I talk to my troops and they love me. So there is a lot of things of professionalism to build in that thing and to take it seriously. And I don't see that seriousness in any country that hasn't been burned by information ops. The Baltic states are very aggressive, but guess what? They've been at the forefront of Russian disinformation. Romania is aggressive. Slovakia, Slovenia are aggressive. Moldova right now are thinking a lot about this. Taiwan is. The French now are because of Mali. So we have to get burned and really feel the IDF right now are trying to build that because they see now that international support for whatever they're doing is undermining, and the hospital communication snafu really told them that if you're behind on those things, the story will go, and you'll have a hard time really engaging in that space in a way that advances your interests. And it's an issue. So my IDF right now is thinking about building like a little bit more capabilities in the information space. All right. Do I get a beer?
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. This brings us to the end of our formal session. JC has been nice enough to volunteer to stick around as long as we buy him a beer, so I've already said that we will. So I think that once again, JC has delivered exactly what we were promising. In other words, an amazingly insightful, if not very frightening, view of the new geopolitical environment that we find ourselves in Canada, and the need to have these engagements, the needs to have this study. So before we conclude, I would just like to take this time to thank Dave Peabody and his team. It is always just so amazing to sit here and look to the future of the type of geopolitical challenges and dangers we face in this amazing environment of this museum. So Dave, thank you very much. This was outstanding. I'd also like to take the time to thank our team at the University of Calgary, both the staff at the Center for Military and Strategic Studies. Once again, they're very much like ducks. They look like everything looks so effortless, and I know just how hard that Denise and Mary are working on this. But we are also very thankful for the support that we are getting from the Faculty of Arts and the Dean's team in assisting us, Kathy, Shannon, I forgot the third one, sorry, I should have written it down. Yes, thank you. In terms of their effort for putting this on so professionally. We are a community. I don't care if you want to include in terms of how you think of it, but the fact that you came out to engage, to discuss, to try to push the envelope on this. This is something that is going to affect all of us. It's going to affect all of our children. The type of knowledge that JC can warn us about in terms of the dangers that we face, or how we of course had our talks on the impacts of the Ukrainian war, or the changing nuclear modernization. We will let you know what our fourth speaker is going to be on and further activities as we go forward. But it is essential for each and every one of us to be thinking and contributing and engaging. So to each and every one of you, thank you for coming out, for giving us the very precious gift of your time so that we can, in fact, spread the word, think about these things, and proceed. And when you see JC going off on some future endeavor, I don't know, NATO's head of staff on terms of misinformation or something where we may not be able to hold on to him, remember, you heard him first here in terms of the discussion.